Good afternoon. Welcome to Senate Education. It's 1:17 on Friday, January 28th. Mr. Farr, thanks so much for accommodating us this afternoon. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Happy Friday afternoon, everybody.
Happy Friday afternoon to you as well. As the committee knows, and those watching, Mr. Farr is here to comment on the budget adjustment numbers that we reviewed yesterday in this committee with Stephanie Barrett, who is from Joint Fiscal. And I don't know, Mr. Farr, if you wouldn't mind just taking a moment to tell us how you got to those numbers, just a little bit about process, and then whether or not that's okay. Senator Terenzini.
Sorry, yeah, he wasn't here.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, Senator Campion. Just a question maybe for Daphne. I'm not seeing anything on our today's page on the website. Am I missing something?
It's on yesterday's from
Okay.
Stephanie, but there's nothing from Scott.
Oh, okay. All right. So I'll look at yesterday's. Thank you.
Yeah, my
That work?
understanding was just to confirm the numbers. So,
Okay.
so I gave testimony a few times over the last year about this kind of oncoming piece about the sixth semester average and how COVID has impacted our ability to recruit and thus enroll students, because the money follows the students and it's spread out over 6 semesters, and we're about 3 semesters into the pandemic. So those lower student numbers are hitting some centers where other centers are doing well. After several meetings over that time with Mike Lawler down at Southwest and Dana Peterson at Middlebury, we came up with what we thought would be a formula that would accurately represent that impact, using the six semester average as a base. And we did a calculation and we came up with what's in the act. The calculation came up to roughly 313, and before you get scared, 313,000 for the River Valley Technical Center School District, around $79,000 for Southwest, and 185 and change for the Hannaford Center. In previous testimony, where I'm asking for less because that's the amount that we need to kind of keep us whole to pre-pandemic times here at RVTC. So our request is 251,000 and change there. So the other thing I want the committee to know is that Chair Webb reached out to me from House Education and asked me if I would do a similar calculation for the rest of the centers in the state, which I'm working on now, and will submit that to her. School administrators are hard to chase down and talk to these days, so expect to see something for the rest of the system that's similar to this.
Mr. Farr, if you were to summarize this in the quickest, if a constituent were to say, hey, Brian, what is this really doing? Would you just, and I know I missed it, but what exactly would you say it's doing? Shoring up what exactly?
Well, if I'm $251,000 short on revenue, so my choice and our board's choice is to either A, boost the assessment, which is directly to the school districts that we send, roughly 36%, or do reductions in staff equal to $251,000. And I don't, given that other conversations are that Act 189, we want to reduce the disincentive in the finance system to attending tech centers. So, and that's a future conversation. So we want to keep our center whole, not reduce any staff and programming, particularly in a time when workforce is such an issue for our state. And I don't know if I gave testimony to this group or not, but each of our centers missed approximately 2,000 student visits of some kind over the time frame, and that's really how we recruit students. And 2,000 is a number because we're all about the same each, so 6,000 between the 3 tech centers. So it really keeps us whole until we can get to the other side of this.
So what do you mean missed? What did you miss exactly?
So one of the big things is students walking in our building, envisioning themselves in our programs.
Okay.
And you don't know it now, but I'm going to tell you, you're in the middle of what's called recruitment season. And
Yeah.
every tech center around the state is hosting visits of some kind. Last year, we were relegated to spiffy online videos and stuff like that. Then nobody was able to access the building. This year, we're allowing students to access the building, but we're trying to do it in a time so we have less students in the building, so we have less chance of transmission. So the impacts are still with us as we hopefully ease out of the pandemic. We'll be able to ease more students in to see the great opportunities at all the tech centers in the state of Vermont. So that's just the 10th graders. We also have trips organized for 7th and 8th graders. So 7th graders do a career scavenger hunt with us, and then 8th graders get to see all the different programmings plus after school. And every center in the state does some version of what I just outlined to you. And, you know, as I talked to Michael down at Southwest and Dana at Middlebury, hey, we do that. So and we're all about the same size. So
yeah.
a
So
lot
numbers,
of normal,
so really your enrollment numbers were down. This helps keep you going through the pandemic and allows you to not have to reduce staff, et cetera. Okay.
yeah.
Senator Perschlick.
Thank you. And I should know this, but why these 3 tech centers and not other ones, or all of them? And you mentioned you were going to do a number for Rep Webb for all of them, but is there, these 3 are set up differently? They're not within the school districts or something like that?
Yeah, we are Technical Center School District, so I have my own school board where other centers in the state are hosted by a host district. And some of this is learning what we're eligible for as funding and we are not. And, you know, we spent a year on the path to this. And as I talked to my local legislative folks, they were interested in, hey, let's help the independents because they weren't eligible for some of the funding that other school districts were. And as we went through the process, you know, I felt like this isn't an issue like that. It really is relief from the impacts of COVID on how our students come to us. So I only had time to do it for the 3 independents. And part of it is voters are going to vote on our budget here in April directly. And I didn't want to sell a budget that said, hey, my cost to your school is increasing by 36%. And we wanted to be able to say, hey, let's get this in hand. So we say, it's not going to be that. And it's a little bit different for the other schools. And now we're circling back to talk to all the other tech centers about how they can have a similar relief.
Is it, just as a follow-up, were the 3 independent tech centers not available or did not get the ESSER money or some of the CRF money?
We got CRF funds, you know, to buy hand sanitizer and all that kind of stuff like everybody else. We got some gear funds. The first round of gear funds that was allocated based on student enrollment and some demographic pieces that we use for equipment. How is this going to play out for our students? But the 3 independents weren't eligible for ESSER, and what we're finding out is other tech centers in the state, while eligible, there wasn't really a direct path for them. And I think you probably have heard testimony from Secretary Boshi about some of that. So this is, you know, it's you never can predict, as you all know, how this is all going to play out in the impacts. And, you know, this is a little bit of a cleanup, I guess. And the other point I want to make is the 6 semester average continues to roll on. So next year at this time, we will, if nothing happens, we will have 5 semesters of student counts within the pandemic timeframe, right? We'll have the spring, which will impact, because we're in recruitment season, the fall numbers of next year. So this is now, and in the future, this may this may be an issue again, but we'll just have to see how it all plays out over time. Our numbers are rising because we're getting a little bit back to normal activities, but hopefully this is a one-time ask.
Senator Hooker, did you have a question?
I was going to ask the same thing about, and ask about numbers and what they're at. So how much are they rising though, Scott? I mean, are you seeing a marked increase, or is it back to, pre-pandemic numbers?
Well, I'm going to talk about my numbers. One of the places we do about 150 students come to us for what's called the intro classes, which are 9th and 10th graders who are trying out. That's where we had really the biggest impact, and it had to do with our neighboring high school where our students come from, mostly for those programs, had to run one of those only 2 days a week that they're here kind of schedules because of, the pandemic. So that's where we're impacted the most. So we're starting to come back. Those 9th and 10th grade pre-tech foundations or intro classes, as they call them, are fully enrolled this year. So if they're 9th and 10th graders and they like it, they'll come back next year. Our level 1
the challenges study of
are up over last year. But again, the numbers kind of have a long tail and hang with you for a while during a bad year. So we're coming back. I know that there's a lot of exciting things as far as CTE and happening in the state. Hopefully the buzz that's going to happen turns out to more enrollments for all the tech centers in the state. We know that employers can't wait to see our graduates.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And as you know from the governor's budget address, as well as his state of the state, we are indeed going to be looking at this going forward, which I'm excited about. I think it's safe to say.
Yeah, we were one of the Act 189 groups along the Southwest. I'm sure that we'll be seeing each other again down the road.
Great. Anything else for Mr. Farr?
No, sorry.
Could I just ask about like adult classes? Do you do adult classes, and how are they faring?
We're doing adult classes. We just finished an L&A class. We were doing EMT classes through the pandemic. Enrollment is down there a little bit. Now, some of that has to do with if you can get a job now if you want it. There's a lot of opportunity out there. So I don't think people feel the urgency as far as training, but the story is different in every region as far as offerings. And our assistant directors, split shift between the day operations and the evening operations. So we have a little less time to give to it, but we're doing okay. It's getting a little bit better as we go along.
Any other questions or comments for Mr. Farr? Scott, thanks again. Really appreciate you jumping in. And this is very helpful. And we'll look forward to continuing our work together, as well as a big thanks for everything you're doing on the ground. We know these aren't easy times, and we really, really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And I know that you folks are moving as fast as you can on multiple things to help. And we appreciate that.
Great. Have a good day. Thanks.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you. Committee, any objections to supporting the recommend that the House put in for budget adjustment? If I don't see any, I'll go down and share that with appropriations later this afternoon. Okay, great. Okay, we now have Senator Rom Hinsdale with us. Welcome, Senator.
Thank you.
There you are. And Senator, are you being joined by Representative Christie?
I don't know. He was going to try and get away, and he did know about the timing from last conversation we had, but
Okay.
I know their committee went late yesterday. I'm not sure. Maybe they're having
Okay.
it.
Well, we're excited to have you with us. We really appreciate you taking the time. Senators, we are now shifting to the question that we have been taking a lot of testimony on to frame it in its simplest way, weighting versus categorical grants for ELL students. And we're going to have to, hoping to move on this decision sometime next week. We need to give finance enough time to work on this as well. And what the last correspondence I had is they're looking for a recommendation from us, basically, in a direction to go in. So today, Senator Rahm Hinsdale is representing the Social Equity Caucus, and a letter that was sent to me, and I apologize, it is now on the website and has been emailed to all of you. And so with that, Senator, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee. And my dog is behind me, and sometimes she
Great.
kind of just has a moment. So forgive me if that happens.
We've come to the right committee. We are all dog fun.
It's sort of their afternoon nap time. Yes.
Great.
But yeah, so I do want to say the letter has there's Coach.
Great.
So I'll pause for a second.
Sure. Representative Christie, are you there?
There he is.
Okay, great. How are you, Representative?
Multitasking, like all of us.
Well, we're excited to have you with us. Welcome to Senate Education. We were just going to pass things over to Senator Rahm Hinsdale, who is going to really take us through the highlights of the letter and the position that the Social Equity Caucus has forwarded to us. And then we'll let the two of you share the floor, but I thought we could start with you, Senator, if that works for you.
Yeah, absolutely, Coach. I was just about, I'm sorry, Representative Christie. I was just about to say that I want to point out that we are co-signers as the chairs of the Social Equity Caucus, but we also had other people who wanted to sign on to the letter sign on as individual legislators who participate in the Social Equity Caucus. There are times when we have a letter that, carries less weight when we are disagreeing or, as respectfully as we can with some of our other colleagues in the legislature. And so we really wanted to make sure people felt comfortable with, whether or not they themselves signed on to the letter. So you'll find those signatures specifically. With that, I'll go through a few of the highlights of the letter. I think the overarching principle for the Social Equity Caucus weighing in is that English language learning students are predominantly people of color in the state, and there's a major racial equity component in terms of when we think about the combination of limited English proficiency and racial justice. And so for us, it was really important that we contemplate, is this a provision that creates a separate but equal sentiment around what English language learning looks like and how it's supported? And there should be a compelling reason if we are going to do that and move from weighting to categorical aid or a block grant or some other form of support for ELL students and programming. And what we tried to do in the letter after we sort of painted that broad brush stroke is go into one of the things we appreciate about what the task force did. Actually, two things that we really appreciate. One being decoupling poverty from English language learning, which had been a kind of rider approach where the idea was if you were an English language learner, you were also eligible as someone who was would be calculated as someone on free or reduced lunch or experiencing poverty. That, that may be the case in many instances. It's not always the case. And to make sure that we're distinguishing there, I think is important from a principled perspective. What that does is change the actual material financial value of the weighting system for districts that have been used to that weighting system that they didn't create. So it does leave a financial hole if you start to decouple those. or at least a new system of calculation that they need to engage in. So there is a consequence, but we still believe in principle is the right thing to do. And two, I think we, I don't want to speak for the whole group, but we appreciate that in rural communities, just an extra weight is not going to give you the base funding you need to have best practices in place to offer ELL if you have a very small ELL population. I don't know that, I think it's $25,000 base funding does everything it needs to give you at least a part of an FTE to deliver quality ELL services. But I'm certainly aware of cases, especially in rural communities that have small ELL populations, of pulling someone out of an office or out of somewhere that, speaks some Spanish and, not having the best practices or resources in place to have the right interpreters available for the right situations in just normal communication with families, let alone, having a qualified ELL instructor on hand to offer that instruction. Just making sure that they have some base funding in rural communities was appreciated by the group who signed on to the letter. I think where we depart is that while that amount of money in rural communities, or as base funding, something like 25,000 as base funding, and then the placeholder right now, we've heard it called a placeholder, and I can't speak to what that means in the formal legislative process and if that was just meant to change. What Professor Tammy Colby, who's written a lot of the underlying philosophy that goes into the report, said as an addition in January to her original report, is that placeholder of $5,000 is pretty deeply inadequate. If the committee and the legislature truly wanted to move forward with cost equity and categorical aid over a system of weighting, then that amount would have to start at maybe $25,000 per student. So let's say you had a district that had 5 ELL students and you started with $25,000. If you just add another $25,000 on top of that with the placeholder of $5,000 per student, that's $50,000. That's very different than, something like $175,000. If you were looking at where she believes the resources, the direction we should go if we're using categorical aid. I know you all are taking on this topic. I hope I haven't lost you with all the numbers, but we at least are we believe much more in $25,000 per student than $5,000 per student for anyone who's interacted with ELL programs and students who require ELL services, plus their families who have limited English proficiency. You are not serving that student well at $5,000. What I believe even the task force knows is Winooski spends an average of $7,500 per student. And when Winooski is not the highest spender, it's an Addison County school. It might be Middlebury School District. I'm not sure, but there is a $10,000 per student spend elsewhere in a smaller community. That all said, we also are very sympathetic to the districts with the larger ELL student populations asking for maximum flexibility like we're giving for weighting with students who are lower income. The separate but equal piece comes in that, and I've worked in Winooski and the Winooski School District and the Essex School District, have been in a number of the schools. One of the issues that comes up so often in the quality of life and quality of educational experience for ELL students, and I'm no expert, but I have seen this time and time again, is being, shuttered off in a wing of the school where they're getting specific individual instruction, where, maybe if they're lucky, the materials, the surveys, the parent engagement is going home in their language. And I'm not meaning to disparage our schools, but there is a real afterthought here, and you can hear it in the mea culpas of many of our school districts who have a growing ELL population. But to say to those districts, we want to make sure that you're spending the money just on ELL students and not on anything else, I think adds an extra layer of administrative oversight for these districts that's unnecessary and unwarranted. These districts are trying to do the best job they can, not only educate those students to bring them up to par in terms of language access and other curriculum with other students, but they are wrapping around the entire student, the entire family, and trying to integrate them to the extent possible with other students. Make sure they're not segregated at the lunch table. Make sure they're not segregated in their educational experience. Make sure they graduate with friends from other cultures and other backgrounds and other communities. And so to say to them, we need, we need to account for every dollar, and we're going to give you aid so that we make sure, sorry for my dog, it only goes to ELL instruction. That I can imagine, having spent a lot of time in those schools, that's pretty challenging when you think about all the programmatic ways that they are trying to integrate those students into the fuller classroom and campus experience. They are doing, in my mind, the best job they can after being significantly underweighted and underfunded for ELL students for so long. And what I want to say is, while I know right now it only affects Burlington and Winooski, what we're talking about is not just Burlington and Winooski, which sometimes, feel separate or distinct from other parts of the state, but we're just talking about hundreds of limited English proficiency families and ELL students. We're talking about the bulk of the communities that we're talking about. And so, in my mind, it's a reason to really specifically listen to those communities. If anything, create an aid program or a grant program that has some taxing capacity on top of it in a hybrid model at the very least, because Burlington and Winooski are communities that have really significant demands placed on them to do the best they can to not only serve those ELL students, but also to help bring the learning we know is possible when you have people from such a global community together. The community is constantly demanding that they bring that to bear. And I do think that requires flexibility, freedom, and taxing capacity. So, I think that is ultimately where we landed. Of course, I know this committee will do its due diligence. I think, it's really incumbent upon the committee, to hear from ELL instructors, from people who, I think a lot of ELL instructors in Vermont are still not from the backgrounds of the people who receive the ELL instruction. So to the extent that you can hear from aides or paraeducators or, the Spectrum Multicultural Youth Support Program, Multicultural Help Desk, that's in many of the schools in Chittenden County, and some of the ELL students themselves. This would be a kind of about us, without us provision otherwise, where there was not a lot of testimony and consideration directly from the affected ELL populations in this change. And I think that's concerning to the Social Equity Caucus as well. Coach, Representative Christie.
Representative Christie, would you like to add something?
Excuse me one sec. I'll be right back.
While we're waiting for Representative Christie, I'm wondering, would you say a little bit more about the separate versus equal comment? Just general, and just pull that apart a little bit more. Tell me a little bit more. Give me some examples, that sort of thing.
So, I mean, if in my mind, if we said, we're giving you resources for students in poverty, but it's going to be a grant because we want to make sure you're spending it only on students in poverty for their instruction. That's what you're saying about ELL students. I mean, it's not an instructional issue. It's a fully curriculum to programming to supporting the whole family, to making sure that you're not saying, here low income child, here's some extra money for you, right? I mean, that's essentially, we're saying it's okay to do that with ELL students, to say we're going to give a certain chunk of money to those districts. And, I think we'd have to have a very compelling reason to do that, because otherwise I do think it's othering in a way that we decided not to do with low-income students. I do know that philosophically, one of the co-chairs of the committee felt like weighting isn't the right way to go at all. Everything should be a grant so that it's very equal for students. What ultimately was put forward by the task force did separate out low-income students from ELL students in this way, saying that that low-income students or free or reduced lunch students, what we were talking about there was programmatic, or I'm looking for other compelling reasons why that should remain with weighting and tax capacity, but you're telling these schools who have ELL populations, we want to make sure every penny is spent on ELL students. I don't think those districts, have tried to avoid spending that money to the best of their ability on ELL students. But the difference in accounting, in my mind, still creates more opportunities to separate them out from the population, to say, you're going to get special instruction over here, you're going to get your resources over here, you're going to get food over here. I mean, I don't personally, I'm not on the education committee, but to the extent that you now have to account for every penny going to those students, that does, in my mind, create the possibility that you have to separate them out from programming in the student population that you didn't have to separate them out from before. Or it's a bit of an accounting nightmare either way.
If I may.
One moment, though, Representative Christie. Senator Perslick, did you want to comment on this while we're on it?
No, I think it'd be good to hear from.
Okay, Representative Christie.
Well, I think Representative Rahm, excuse me, I should say Senator, the progression, right? Senator Rahm Hinsdale brought up a couple of interesting points. And as you might recall, when we were on House Ed together, when we got visited by the Africana students from up north, we won't designate where up north, but they came and they shared their story. And this wasn't in committee, it was in the hall. And you and I were standing there listening to them. And I think both of our jaws dropped when they said they were kind of segregated in their own building because it was easier to deal with in that particular district. And that was when Commissioner Villaseca was the education commissioner. And you and I called him and asked him to come over because we couldn't believe what we just heard. And he did. And what I'm getting at is it exemplifies the question about, grants and becoming easier to work with a population by isolating the population. And is it the best educational approach? I think every educator in the room goes, no. But we need to make sure that through this process that all of our students are equitably supported. And that isn't a lofty, ask. When we integrate special ed students, for example, into the classroom, the mainstream classrooms, the goal there is to ensure that they get a full educational experience. Now they're supported, by special educators in the same way that an ELL student might be supported by a translator. But at the same time, they're still getting that experience of being in the classroom, with their peers and being fully immersed. That's that other, that internal functionality, piece that concerns me as an educator. We can talk about, weights or grants, but at the end of the day, it's how we support, our students in their day-to-day experience. If that's helpful.
Yeah, very. Senator Perslick.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Senator Rahm Hinsdale, Representative Christie, for coming and for your comments and for your work and advocacy for these students. I think it's really admirable, and I appreciate it. And I get the the kind of ridiculousness for me to differ with the chairs of the Social Equity Caucus on what's more equitable. But when I was on the task force, why I did think the doing the grants, because I did do it as what I thought was a better equitable way to support the ELL students. I don't see it as separating, because right now my understanding is, and I could be corrected on this, that all spending on ELL students now has to be tracked. So we wouldn't be asking for any different than they're doing now. The reason we know that Winooski was like 7,000 and that district, I think Addison district was 10,000, is because it's already tracked. And then we just divide it by students. So I didn't see any additional administrative burden whatsoever on the grants, but I saw it as a way to make sure that equitable funding was given to those students. What I worried about was the parent that came to me and said, hey, look at the study, it's $25,000, but my school's only spending 5,000. We gave them the weight to do 25, but they chose 5. What do I tell those parents of we, the state, had an opportunity to make sure that the equitable amount went to those ELL students, and we chose not to. And I think there's good reasons not to, for the flexibility and the independence and the local control reasons, but I don't understand the argument that it's less equitable. I understand that it's different, and I totally see that if you're going to do something different for these, largely Black and brown Vermonters, that's going to raise a lot of red flags, and we should be very careful about that. But I saw it as making sure that the resources that are needed. So Dr. Colby said, hey, if you want these students to have the same outcomes, the average is around $25,000. Well, let's make sure that those resources are actually being deployed and do so in the best way possible. And it's been a kind of the frustration for me in working with others that didn't like the grants, is that they haven't engaged in a way of saying, what's the best way to do this? Like, how can we make it so that resources get to the kids? As Representative Christie said, on the end of the day, it's what's happening with these kids in the school. How can we structure it in a way that really makes that happen and isn't like overly burdensome or not reliable or the other things that have happened? Because I see in the letter, you said that there was a higher degree of scrutiny with the ELL, but I think it's the reverse, because if there are weights, the school board has to justify the spending and go through the school board process of justifying that ELL cost and what the tax implications would be. And then it has to go in front of the voters. And then the voters have to justify the spending to the voters. And I'm not worried at all about Winooski and Burlington spending that money, because it's part of the community. But I am worried about how that discussion might happen in other parts of the community. But if you do a grant or aid, it's just direct. There's no scrutiny. It's just like, here's the way you do it. And I think there's some criticism of picking a number that Dr. Colby gave us and others. And I think the way we do it with special education now, I don't know if the Social Equity Caucus thinks that the way we fund special education is inequitable, but we do it, that's each school decides what's needed for their special education students, and then the state reimburses them for that expense. And Dr. Colby did mention that, and it's something that I would think is maybe a way to meet the independence and flexibility of each school district, but still making sure that funding is going to those ELL students.
So
Yes, please.
yeah, so if I may, Senator Porch, completely respectfully able to sort of have this back and forth, and I appreciate that, because I know how much time you put and others on the task force put into this. I don't know if you disagree that one thing that stymied the task force was just capacity from Joint Fiscal Office and the Agency of Education. And so early on in the process, this has mattered to the Social Equity Caucus for a long time. It was our priority. Last year, I should say, it's been on the priority list since the start of session, and something we've all been following carefully. And what I tried to communicate, to our Senate counterpart leading the task force was we want to remain open as a caucus to all possibilities. We just want to be able to compare them side by side. We want to see what the weighting would look like versus what the categorical aid would look like. What ended up happening, when your task force was done, is you still had a $5,000 placeholder in there. And that made it extreme when we never got the weighting information that we would need to make a comparison. So I understand that everybody wishes people came to the table differently. I personally can't find fault with the way Burlington and Winooski showed up in that conversation because they tried to put in plain English, and pun intended here, what would happen based on what they saw coming out of the task force. And as we put toward the end of the letter, because I couldn't think of a better way to say it than to just include their words, they would be looking at not hiring ELL positions that they had planned to hire and cutting positions. So until they are shown the comparative information, and I hope this committee will look at all the comparative information, then I don't know that we have enough information to feel confident in where a categorical aid dollar amount would land. That alone is probably the reason why districts say, please leave the decision-making power with us. Don't hold on to the decision-making power in Montpelier, because they've had plenty of reasons in the past to not trust that we will maintain their best interests. No offense to any of us, and particularly this committee, which I think did probably, one of the best jobs of any committee last session, rising to the occasion of the pandemic. But, generally we believe in local control. We have a lot of communities who would like to have this conversation themselves, not hear from Montpelier, we're not increasing your aid this year, even though we know X, Y, or Z has happened. I can't speak for special ed and how to do that comparison, but I think at the end of the day, we're pleading our case and we're asking this committee to do deep due diligence from a curricular perspective, not, from a taxing perspective or from a, revenue perspective. But what does this mean? Does this shift materially impact those students? And if you have the two largest districts in the state, telling you that, largest meaning with ELL student population, we're talking 40% in Winooski. If they're telling you this is going to harm them, I think that's the worst possible outcome that they could have imagined from this task force and this work. They really thought a lot of wrongs would be righted. And right now, this is causing them to have to worry about next year's budget. And I don't think that's what any of us intended. And I don't think that serves the future generation of leaders and learners and thinkers and doctors and nurses. And, our future is on the line, because this is a lot of young people. 90% of our population growth in Vermont has come from the in-migration of people of color in the last decade. And many of those are people who have come through the refugee resettlement program. And if we're holding back our newest learners, then we are doing a disservice to the state. So I think at the end of the day, we want it to be weighed that carefully, and to center those who would be most impacted in how we discuss whether this rights or wrongs things moving forward.
Senator Perschlick or Senator Hooker, both of whom are on this committee, any comments in response to that? Yes, Senator Perschlick, please.
I just want to say, I totally agree with what Senator Ron Hinsdale just said. The only caveat or comment I want to make is that, the information we got from Nicole Mace from Winooski was that the budget changes are because of the one-time ESS, the ESSER money that they spent on hiring. The change that's in next year's budget isn't because of if we did nothing, they'd still have that impact. So it's not what we're doing that's having that impact, because they use those one-time funds. The weights are being recommended to go up, and we can deal, I think, with their poverty, how the poverty is issued, to make sure that they're not getting harmed by that change. And we can also, what I don't think was in that, and I totally agree with what Senator Hinsdale said about not blaming the way they came to it, because they came forward with the concerns about what the information that they had. But I think there is ways of addressing those things with the grants. And I think if they were to be reimbursed for all the money they're spending on ELL, they wouldn't have that fact. If they were to get a grant of $25,000 per ELL student, that's over 300% more than they're spending today. So I think those things weren't part of that calculation about budget from this year and last year and the one-time funds. But I totally agree with the importance and how it is critical that we get it right. And I appreciate the efforts of the Social Equity Caucus to say, hey, you guys better be getting this right, because this is extremely important. And these students deserve our best thinking on this. And I'm open to it all. But I want to make sure that we are getting those resources to these students. I don't want to have it in the future to say, the outcomes aren't what we thought they were going to be by giving this local control. Some school districts used their taxing capacity not to increase ELL, but to lower taxes. And then the districts whose taxes went up, I think the people I've talked to from my towns who look at the numbers and say, our taxes are going to go up, they say, we're okay with that. We're okay with our taxes going up to support ELL students because we realize that's important. And that's okay. But it's difficult for them to say, our taxes are going to go up so somebody else's taxes can go down without any benefit or the full benefit that the empirical evidence shows is needed for those students. That's my only concern.
Senator Hinsdale.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would say is that educating our ELL students is a benefit to the entire state. And so, I absolutely hear you. We are now looking at communities who say, please send us incoming arrivals, new immigrants, new refugees. We want to open our arms. And so, I think it is a statewide conversation that we're beginning to have about what it means to spend the right amount of money on those students and that population, but also create that flexibility in the budget to have conversations with your community about how you do that in a way that doesn't separate them out from the population. So, I think it's going to be more than Burlington and Winooski who are having that conversation. Please listen to them, because we've learned a lot of lessons over the years in Burlington and Winooski about how to get that right while not experiencing backlash. I mean, Senator Lyons and Senator Chittenden can understand, we have had budgets go down, and we have had ELL students blamed for those budgets, but now you could have the opposite, and people could start to say, you're getting so much money for ELL students, you don't need anything from me. It should still remain a community conversation about how to get this right. And those community conversations have been difficult, but they're the foundation of our democracy, our local democracy in Vermont.
Senator Chittenden.
I just want to echo what I heard Senator Perschlick end at the end there, and add just one perspective to hear Senator Hinsdale and Coach Christie's, Representative Christie's reaction. So I definitely agree that the taxpayers I speak to are ready to pay more to support these kids. And the concern they have is they have hesitations to just pay more in taxes so that some communities pay less in taxes. So tying it, that's where categorical aid, I think, came into the conversation, just to ensure that these students are benefiting from the additional revenues. But I also have been persuaded that categorical aid is problematic when you tie strings to it, because that creates a whole bunch of inefficiencies and administrative burden. But I think there's a value in looking at the mixed approach that Professor Colby talked about for certain school districts with very few ELLs to get some of that assurance and methods, while still looking at the pupil weights for the larger districts to ensure that money goes to those districts to support across the curriculum. I think the other piece that at some point I'd love to hear the Social Equities Caucus's perspective on, which I haven't seen presentation yet, but Professor Colby acknowledged that in a role in the Board of Education, could be a good part of this, would be state standards of service accessibility levels. So that's not strings attached. to the dollars, but
Um,
instead it's assurances setting that that certain amount of
Rebecca
availability.
Turner. how are
Coach,
you?
would you mind muting yourself, or Daphne, would you please mute Coach? Thanks. Sorry,
I'm
Senator.
just about done. My apologies.
Nope.
But I just think that there could be some real merit in the state making clear every school district has to have a certain amount of available capacity or pupil ratio to support services for these ELL students. And that's not tying strings to certain categorical aids, but it's setting service standards while maintaining local control. We're still assuring that these kids are getting, that they are mandated to have a certain degree of supports. That's all I really want to say. I'd love to hear any reactions to those notions if Senator Rom Hinsdale has any to offer.
I mean, if what comes of this, if one of the things that comes of this is trying to standardize best practices for ELL curriculum and support around the state, I think that's a great outcome of this. I was before the committee last year saying, Burlington-Winooski had partially figured out support for the family so that the student is a better learner. And they had been really stymied by the pandemic and losing access to their wraparound services and having a cultural liaison. I think you will find that if you have Burlington and Winooski here, you have partners to help set a standard of best practices that they are constantly striving to meet, but have, that was laid at their feet, decades ago with our refugee resettlement program and the value that that's added to the state. I think they have instituted a lot of best practices over time that they'd be willing to share and help standardize with Agency of Education. So I think that would be an incredible goal. And yes, I really do think there is a possibility of a hybrid model for the communities we're talking about that would struggle to use their taxing capacity specifically to support ELL students. You just have to hear directly from the districts where we've learned sometimes the hard way that, underfunding these programs underserves our entire community. And so, I think you see deep support for taxing capacity and for integrative programming that really doesn't say we're going to spend these dollars over here on these students, but we're benefiting everyone by having a global population here. And we want to make sure that we do as much as we can to give all the opportunities possible for those communities to interact with each other and not sort of keep counting pennies while we're doing it.
Senator Lyons.
Just say thank you to Senator Ram and Representative Christie for bringing your information from the Equity Caucus. It's critically important. I think we should remind ourselves that what we're talking about today isn't really anything new. We've been integrating immigrants and folks from other places into our school systems for years. Okay, so I know I'm old. When there was a deluge of students from Cuba during the Cuban regime change, I helped my school welcome those kids into our classes, and it continues. We've done that with many different groups, whether it was the Bosnians back in the 90s in Vermont, or whether it's today with the Somalian community that we see in Winooski or others in Winooski and Burlington. We understand the need to educate these kids without discrimination. And when you start, for me, the biggest part of this question is, why do we separate out the treatment of these kids? It makes it seem as if it's something extraordinary, different, unusual, when in reality, we would like to see full integration and wraparound services, as we're seeing in the schools with the greatest experience. If there is a way to get some best practice into our education, Agency of Education, that would be awesome. But I don't think that's going to that may happen concurrently with our decision, but I'm not sure. But so I'm rattling on, but thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I just want to thank you both very much for coming in. We are going to continue on this topic. We are hoping to finalize our work next week, which would be a letter to the Finance Committee and a recommendation I think we're all still grappling with this. There's no question
Yeah.
in my mind. I know very few people who are believe this is settled science, if you will. And so we may have you back, but in the meantime, please accept our thanks, and we'll look forward to staying in touch.
Well, thank you very much,
Yeah.
Senator. I think the capacity of your committee supersedes the capacity of our agency of education at this moment. What I heard this afternoon gives me great hope that we'll be able to move this forward. Senator Rahm's comment about best practice. I didn't know a good teaching technique that I wouldn't borrow as a classroom teacher because it benefited all of my students. And that's what we're talking about here. We want to benefit all of our students. So I really want to appreciate and say thank you to everybody here today, because if we work together, we can get this thing to work the way it needs to. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, S219. Thank you both again for coming in.
Thanks for a respectful discussion. Appreciate it.
Mr. Olson, how are you?
I'm well, and yourself?
Good. Thanks for being with us. You are still the chair of the Vermont State Board of Education. Is that correct?
As of 2 o'clock today, I am, yes.
You still are? Okay, terrific. Well, we're very happy to have you with us. We have been making our way down another issue, church and state. I know you've been following our work, and I am very curious to hear the state board's position on this. You know, we have heard from a number of different attorneys. We have considered a number of different approaches. This is work that we're also hoping to move out in the next week or so. And I know that the state board has been looking at this issue as well. So I'm wondering if you might give us some insight into what you're all looking at and whether or not what you're considering might be helpful to our work. So with that, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. So for the record, Oliver Olson, I am the chair of the State Board of Education. And I'll have to apologize in advance. The last few years, my predecessor was able to address you as a former member of your chamber, and you have to contend with a retired member of the other chamber.
Yeah, we did have that conversation before we went live, and I think we're prepared. We went through a brief training. Not everyone passed it, but let's see how it goes.
Wonderful. So I do appreciate the invitation to offer some reflections and thoughts on S219. So just a safe harbor statement. The State Board of Education and its members, including myself, are defendants in pending litigation on some of the subject matter contained within pertaining to some of the subject matter within S219. So you'll have to bear with me as I'll need to be obviously a little bit cautious and may not be able to comment specifically on certain points. But I'll try to address some of the issues in the abstract in a way that I think might be helpful. So I should also clarify, the SBE has not had the opportunity to discuss S219, but it has been actively engaged in rulemaking on a number of issues pertaining to the approval of independent schools that I do think are relevant to this discussion, and I'll go through those today. Before I go any further, though, I do want to just read briefly from a statement that the Board of Education adopted in the summer of 2020 that is relevant to our position on some of the underlying issues. And that is that the Vermont State Board of Education denounces racism and affirms its commitment to equity and excellence for all students, regardless of race, gender identity or expression, sexual orientation, national origin, color, disability, religion, or socioeconomic status. And that is sort of the lens that we look at things through on our board, and how I'll sort of address some of the topics before us today. So I think it's, my sense that the state board and your committee really are aligned on this commitment to equity and non-discrimination. And when we see a problem, we shouldn't shy away from it. We should address the issue, protect our students and the educators who serve them, and definitely would see this as a priority. So I'd like to walk through a little bit of what we're tackling with our rulemaking as it pertains to independent schools, because it is certainly relevant to some matters here. There are a number of things that we're addressing in our update of the rules, but a few things that we're looking to improve upon relate to the Public Accommodations Act and compliance with the Public Accommodations Act. It is our position as the board that the Public Accommodations Act applies to all schools in Vermont, whether they're public schools or independent schools. That's a position that is supported by legal counsel that we've heard from, as well as the Human Rights Commission. So with that said, what we're looking to do with our rules that should be coming to LCAR within the next few months is to explicitly require that a school seeking approved independent status demonstrate compliance with the Public Accommodations Act and the labor laws at 3 VSA 495, which address discrimination in an employment context. Secondly, to require a statement of non-discrimination on the school's website, and that an assurance be to this effect be signed by the head of the school. So this is really important as you guys are thinking about ways of ensuring compliance with these important laws in a few different ways. So as I read through the bill, I noticed that there were references to school boards looking for certain assurances from schools. And I would suggest that a more efficient mechanism to accomplish this objective is through the approval process. So what that gives you is, the State Board of Education already has an approval process. And that there's sort of two levels of that approval. So there's a sort of general approved independent school status. And then with the passage of Act 173, there's now sort of another tier which says that you're approved for purposes of receiving public tuition. And our new rulemaking establishes the standards that schools need to adhere to be approved in one of those categories. So as you're thinking about crafting this bill, I would encourage you to think about it in the context of the existing approval process, because what the end result is, there's a list of approved schools. So if you're a school board or school district and you need to make a decision about whether a particular school is eligible for tuition, you can simply look at the list of approved schools. You don't have to go to each school individually. So it creates I would suggest a more efficient, a more effective, and importantly, a consistent process. And to the extent that there are problems, there are concerns, there's a very public process to address those issues as part of the approval process. There's also a process to deal with complaints. So for example, if a school is, just as an example, if a school has been approved and a year or two later, there is a determination, let's say, for example, by the Human Rights Commission, that school is in violation of the Public Accommodations Act, the Agency of Education could bring a recommendation back to the State Board of Education to have that approval status revoked. The school would be afforded due process, and if there was a finding that there was in fact a problem of a significant nature, we would have the ability to revoke that approval status, and again, adjust that list accordingly. So it takes the school districts out of the mix. It provides a more streamlined and effective and consistent process. So as you're thinking about other standards that you might want to apply, I know using that same sort of framework that we already have in place, I'll walk through a really kind of extreme example. Might be if a school wanted to establish a football academy. We're all familiar with kind of our ski academies, but let's say an entity wanted to establish a football academy, and a big part of its mission was training football players. We as a state might feel, you as legislators may feel that it's not in the state's interest to be expending public funds to train students in full contact sports because we're concerned about concussions, things of that nature. So you could establish a standard that says to be eligible for approval, you need to ensure that no funds go towards a football program. An educational program, okay, but not to a football program. With that standard in place, and there could be rulemaking around it, when the State Board of Education considered an application for approval status, we could go through, we could examine what they were seeking to do, and if there was a standard and a requirement for certain certifications to be made, we could look at that and say, okay, is there a certification to ensure that no public money will go towards the football program? If so, you're good to go. If not, you're not going to be approved. And then ultimately, when students seek to apply to that school, the school district would have the ability to look at the list and simply see if they were approved or not approved. So anyway, just some thoughts. I'm happy to entertain any questions.
That's great testimony. Very interesting. Questions for Representative Olson? So yes, Senator Perslick, please.
Thanks. I guess what we heard from Professor Teachout, I don't know if you saw that, Oliver, but he talked about keeping the approval process for the independent schools, but then kind of adding another layer that maybe the board would do is like whether they're eligible to receive the state funding. Is that that would be the same thing that you were just talking about, the example with the football?
Yes, and we already have that now. That came into being as part of Act 173. So we now, that's where historically we had recognized schools and we had approved schools. And I think you probably know recognized schools, that's a whole other class. We can ignore that. But historically approved schools, if you were approved, you were eligible for, you could be eligible for tuition. With 173, there are additional criteria for this sort of elevated status of approval that gives you access to public funding. So that mechanism's already there. And we could address this through a combination of statutory change aligned with our rules and subsequent rulemaking to refine the procedures.
Thanks.
Senator Chittenden.
I'd love to get your testimony in writing. I don't see it on the website yet. A few of the things you mentioned at the beginning about a statement and having something signed by the head of the school. I'm interested to follow up on that. I didn't hear anything in what you said as being in conflict with the trajectory of our S219 so far. I'd love to overlay it some more, but it seems like it's in line with the direction that we've been going in based on testimony we've received. One question I have for you from your perspective, and maybe you can't answer this because of the outstanding lawsuits. We did receive some caution from a very respected representative from the school board district, Sue Siglowski, really encouraging us to wait until the Macon decision comes out. Do you have any thoughts or perspectives on the timing of when S219, if it moves forward this legislative session, if it moves forward with a year and delayed effective date, or if we should wait until that Supreme Court comes out? Do you have any thoughts or reaction to that topic?
That's an area where I do need to be particularly cautious because the litigation is on that particular point. But I would, my focus is particularly on the discrimination elements. That's something that is of great concern to the state board, and we see that as an opportunity that should be addressed with some urgency. We don't see a reason to delay action on that. And what we're doing in rules, and I can provide you provide the committee with sort of where we're at with our some of our drafting, is we're making specific reference to the Public Accommodation Act, which is at it's at Title 9, Chapter 141, and also the labor discrimination laws at 3 VSA 495. And what's important, there were, some folks who were really pushing for specific language, and what we have done very strategically is made reference to those statutory sites with the idea that you may want to add additional protected classes or remove particular exemptions. And so I did take note that one of the things that you do, at least in the draft, I think 2.1, I saw that there's an exemption that you're contemplating the removal of. Well, in the rule making that we're going through, we're making reference to the statute. So as you make changes to the statute, those will just naturally flow through as part of our rules.
So it sounds to me, and I wish Ledge Council were here, but they'll get caught up. They're working on different drafts. They're kind of looking at different options here for us. But it sounds to me, Oliver, as though you really can take care almost fully of the anti-discrimination piece.
Almost
as it
fully
relates to, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, almost fully, as well, certainly fully as it relates to students. Now, I understand we've had legal counsel that says Public Accommodations Act applies to all schools, independent, public, doesn't matter. I understand that there could be an argument that it may not. And so I think if there is an opportunity to clarify that, I feel comfortable in saying the State Board of Ed would be very supportive of that, because that's certainly our intent. That's how we interpret the law, and that's how we're applying it with our updated rulemaking.
Okay. Senator Hooker, please.
Thank you, Oliver, for bringing this to us. Can you give me a definition of the Public Accommodations Act? Generally speaking.
Generally speaking, if you think about your protected classes, you cannot discriminate on the basis of I don't have it in front of me right now, but
race,
ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, disabilities. And there's a special provision within the Public Accommodation Act that addresses disabilities in an educational setting, because there are some nuances, particularly and this is where you have to, I think it's important to reference back to the Public Accommodations Act, because there are schools that have particular specialties when it comes to disabilities. And I'm personally aware of this because I have a child with multiple disabilities, very complex disabilities, and he attends a highly specialized school for his disabilities as part of an IEP. They're the perfect school, the right school to meet his very unique needs. They're not the right school to serve other types of disabilities, right? So just as an extreme example, you could think of the Perkins School for the Blind versus, what was the Austin School for the Deaf, right? Very different focus areas. So not the kind of discrimination in a disability context that we might be thinking of. And the Public Accommodations Act, the specific language in there is calibrated for that purpose.
Okay, thanks.
Any other comments from you, Representative Olson, or questions from the committee at this point? This has been very helpful. And we'll keep in contact. We'll share our next draft with you as well, and possibly have you back.
Excellent. Thank you for the opportunity. And again, I appreciate your focus on these really important issues, and I think important not to shy away from them.
Thank you. Okay. So we are now going to shift to S249. This is an act relating to increasing gradually the mandatory age of school attendance. This bill was introduced by Senator Nitka last week. And so we are just waiting for our witnesses. So I'm going to have to run down to appropriations at about 2:45. So at that point, Cheryl, if you don't mind taking over. And for now, why don't we just take a 2-minute break until everybody gets here? So 3 minutes, 2:35, we'll